You know, something else that's been asked about a number of times is the way we have the solar panels mounted to the roof, and are they conventional panels or are they the flexible panels? So I'll show you what we do. We do have the conventional type panels, not the flexi panels. I'll show you the way we mounted this. Okay, so with any typical Bimini, I've undone this Bimini top here at the rear portion here to focus in on the back. And with any of these Biminis, they usually have a spot here where there's like where the two zippers meet and there's a little hole here. Now what you do is you take advantage of that. And there's these mounts, they're called, I don't know if you can see that, but it's referred to as a Gemini mount. And it's basically one of those Bimini mounts that has the clamp with the Allen screw. But the big difference with these ones is right here. They actually have this little piece of stainless that comes out with a screw on it, and it attaches right here. Now that allows you to attach this other rail. Furthermore, you make this hoop that goes over to the other side, and you have the match arrangement on the other side. You also have this arrangement here with this Gemini mount at the front of the rail, and that allows you to sort of make kind of a racking that goes on top and is elevated over top of the Bimini top, so it actually doesn't touch it. And then we just basically use some simple U-bolts and we mount the panel. I used the sewing machine and just made like a sunbrella sleeve here with some snaps on it, and that's what I contain the wiring in. Just sort of cleans it up a little bit, the way it's sort of protected and sort of blends in with the canvas rather than a couple of wires by themselves. This is a really good way to mount your panels over top of the Bimini top. I can't say I designed it, I saw somebody else at the marina do it, and now that I've done it, there's probably about 3 or 4 other boats that I've seen that have done the same thing and taken advantage, because it's such a great spot to put panels. Bimini frame can hold it no problem. I think the panels weigh about 80 to 90 pounds. Well worth it.
I want to start by saying power is everything. Well, not quite, but it is a top contender if you have a number of items on board that consume electricity. Although we continue to typically manage this power load between our engine alternators when we're cruising, or if we go to docks we can charge up, or if we have a genset you might charge your batteries regularly every day by that method. The uprising recently in so many years of solar power is undeniable by now. There is so much power to be absorbed, and the efficiency has gone way up over the years. The question is how to go about this in a cost-effective way. In this video I want to explain at least a method that I've utilized and that I think can be repeated on a number of boats with remarkable results. Now, the methods that I'll describe, this is a method that I've used, and while it may be applicable on our boat, it might not be quite as applicable on some other boats. The systems that I'll describe, they'll be scalable to 12 volts, 24 volts, 36, and even 48 volts. However, most boats I think that we'll be talking about will be applicable to 12 volts only. Unless you're over in Europe or, you know, on larger boats, some of them have higher voltage storage banks, but I think for most intensive purposes, 12 volts would be the storage bank that we'd be discussing here. I want to talk about is durability. On the solar that I've done in recent years, I've used the extruded aluminum frame panels with glass. I found these panels are very rugged, very tough. You need only compare the warranties between the flexible and the rigid type of panels. Usually about 20 to 25 years on the rigid panels versus, you know, commonly about 5 years on the flexible panels. And I think that probably does give you a bit of an indication of the rugged nature of the glass and aluminum panels. Now, I'm not saying that the flex panels will only last 5 years, but I think it does give an indication that there is a much longer life expectation for, you know, glass framed in aluminum versus the flex panels. Now, I have owned the flex panels before. I did pick up 4 100-watt panels and put them on there. Now, the trouble is you know, they don't scale quite as well because they are only 12-volt panels. If you want to be able to connect them in series and up the voltage of your solar array, they don't really work, and they're not really recommended for that type of connection. I think it's pretty hard on them, especially if you get a shadow. If they do start to get warm, generally when a shadow goes across them, it creates a resistance area. And if that resistance gets hot enough and it can't dispel that heat, quite often, you know, with the flexible panels, you'll put them over top of something and that can actually cause damage to the solar cells in the circuits there. So something to keep in mind. Generally, when you're using the aluminum framed glass panels or rigid panels, they kind of force you to have that air gap underneath of a couple inches, which always gives it the option to be able to dispel heat into that spot. Sometimes with the flexible panels though, they are the best fit, especially for a bit smaller applications, or I think for a top-up system, if you already have quite a bit, but you just want to utilize a little bit of that extra space that you have, I think they can kind of work good for that. Or just smaller applications, they can work extremely well. Now, the next thing I wanted to kind of discuss is scalability. Now, with the aluminum framed glass panels, more specifically the commercial grade panels, there is a clear advantage to how you can scale those up and and not really add additional complications, or in this case, additional electrical connections to connect them. Just because their sheer size, it allows you to be able to do that. Also, when you take these larger panels too and you connect them in series, it gives you the ability to up your voltage. Generally with these larger commercial panels, you're going to be looking at 24 volt panels or 36 volt panels. Now, they actually put out higher voltages than that. That's kind of their base voltage. Like a 24 will usually put out well over or even slightly over 30 volts. Likewise with a 36 volt panel, you're going to be probably pushing in the mid 40s somewheres. By putting those in series, you end up doubling or adding up those amounts of voltage. Now, the advantage to that is you get to reduce the wiring size because you're bringing up the voltage. Your watts continue to go up, but with the voltage, it doesn't require as heavy a gauge of wire, and there's less electrical loss, especially if you have a fair distance between where your panels are located and where your controller and batteries are located. The further that distance gets, and remember, you have to properly measure that, you have to measure the round trip of that circuit. And every time you add so many feet to it, you have to put bigger wire on that circuit. Now, the size of that wire is very specific to how many volts. At 12 volts, you have to put very thick wire the longer it gets, especially when you start getting up 50, 60, 70 feet. And that sounds like a lot, but by the time you do so many twists and turns, it does add up. But once you actually get your voltage to 70 to 100 volts, the size of your wire can be much, much smaller. On our boat, for instance, I just use 10 gauge wire going to the back and 10 gauge wire going to the fly bridge as well. There's very, very little line loss. So next thing to talk about is the mounting. So I think the mounting is actually the most difficult part, and that is actually one of the things I probably want to focus on with this conversation. As far as solar controllers, as far as wiring them up and hooking them up to batteries and stuff like that, there's a lot of information out there for that. But I found this method that I've used to especially mount the panels over top of the Bimini, focusing on that because I really haven't seen that done too much. It's something that I've done, and it's something that I've seen a number of boats at our marina do and stuff like that, and I'm seeing it pop up more and more here in the Pacific Northwest. But when I look around on YouTube and stuff, I have not actually seen too many boats that do that. So what I want to do is I do want to discuss the very specific parts and the process, give you visuals on how I went about this, and if you choose to, you can apply these same principles to whatever setup you might have. Now, it works really good on any sort of a power boat that has a Bimini top, over top of a fly bridge works really good. I think it could also work good in other applications, even something such as a sailboat. Now, although a sailboat, with the arch that can come off the back, and you can get those panels further and further away from the boom and the mast and any sort of, reduce any risk of shadowing. If you have a little bit more of a clear area wherever you have a boat top or any sort of a Bimini boat top, I think this principle applies quite well, and it's a pretty good way to do it. Now, I've seen panels mounted in lots of various places on lots of different boats, and I don't think I can emphasize this point enough of reducing risk of shadowing as much as possible. It takes so little shadowing to cause a major power loss. One thing I've done on our boat, and I did it on our last boat, and I always make sure that there is some sort of a monitoring system, even if it's just a simple ammeter or being able to at least watch the voltage. But with solar, you really want to watch the amps or the watts and see how much power is coming in. And I've monitored this when a shadow comes across the panel and even just goes across a few cells. The power drop is very dramatic. Putting the panel anywhere close to a radar dome, anywhere close to a mast, even wires, shrouds, anything that casts a shadow. There's some configurations that can be made to withstand it better than others, but I think as a rule, if you're designing your system, it will really give you a huge advantage of avoiding shadowing at all costs. Any shadowing is going to really significantly give you a power loss on how much power you bring in. And you know, especially if you're not actually watching how much power you're getting, if you don't have any shadows, it's going to work good. If you start getting some shadows, very little, it's going to make a huge impact to how much power you actually put into your bank. So on that note, you know, the advantages of putting your panels up high on the Bimini and not lower down is generally when you get up on that Bimini, there's very little shadowing. So you're going to get pretty much whatever time of the year it is, whatever the amount of sunlight or solar power is available, you're going to get it all. You know, and it's not about the sunny days, the longest days of the year. It's actually more about the shoulder season, or it's more about the overcast or rainy days. Because if your panels are large enough and they don't get any shadowing and they get the light, even on rainy days or even on heavily overcasted days, you'll still bring in power. And even if that power is just enough so you're not actually dipping into your actual storage of your battery, and it's just keeping your stuff on through the day and you're not actually using power from your battery, that's a big advantage. You know, it's very dependent on having those panels where they're going to get full sunlight or as much light is available on a given day. Now, the disadvantages of the system. Probably one of the primary disadvantages is if you're one of those people who like to put down your Bimini and retract it to get full sun and get that kind of convertible top experience, this pretty much stops that, because unless you remove the panels, which this is more of an installation, it's more something you leave on there, unless you're going to change out the system or unless you're doing some significant amount of work that requires you to remove them. Once you put this in place, your Bimini top is up. You know, one other advantage it does is it actually protects all that sunbrella, because when the panels are over top, you're not getting the weather, you're not getting the rain, any growth on it, and your waterproofing will last you a lot longer. But as I said, you can no longer retract the top on nice days if you really like the sun. And lastly, with the aesthetics, I think you know, if you do a really nice job at radiusing the pieces and forming them properly and choosing, not oversizing the panels too much, but going with panels that you can sort of keep well within the perimeter of your Bimini top, there is an aesthetic portion to this. So, you know, we all like boats to look nice. Some of us are willing to tolerate more than others on utility over aesthetics. But I want to say you want to keep these panels, you know, if they're on top of the Bimini, you want to keep them enough from the inside. Generally, when you get a Bimini up fairly high, it's not something that people see if there's something just inside of the perimeters. You may not even notice they're there. And also weight-wise, because depending on the size of the boat, depending on the stability of the boat, you know, the solar panels are not that heavy. You're probably talking about 100 pounds plus some tubing. While that might sound like a lot up that high, you know, if you're talking about a flybridge and you're talking about putting an extra person up there, well, it's kind of like having an extra person on the flybridge. So in rough seas, you might not want to have a huge crew up there, but it's at least like having 1 or 2 people up there if there's already somebody up there. So you don't want to do anything that challenges the boat's stability. And if you already have a lot of top heavy stuff on there, let's say you have a large dinghy on high up on a back deck, and you might have a lot of gear up there, a lot of heavy stuff, this might not be the additional things you want to put up there. And I think for most situations, it's not enough weight that's going to cause a significant problem or any problem at all. But I would leave that to you and your own calculations to determine if that's a problem or any sort of a safety risk on your boat. Okay, so size-wise, commercial panels. Commercial panels generally range from they're all about 40 inches wide, and they're generally started about 64, 65 inches. The other common one is 40 inches by 80 inches, and there are a few sizes in between, but I find there's usually the standard size commercial, which is the 40 by 65, and then there's the oversized, which are 40 by 80. So depending on which measurements you have to work with, those are the sizes. We have put the ones on the very top of our boat on the Bimini, and those are the 40 by 80s. And We have 2 of them up there, and each one puts out 400 watts independently. So putting them together, you get a total of 800 watts out of those 2 panels. Over top of the Bimini, we could probably even put a 3rd one. Haven't been too interested in it because we're doing remarkably well with just those 2 up there. It makes it pretty simple to just put 2 panels up there, and yeah, it's a lot of power, and it really helps out. So with charge controllers, although we're not going to look at this too heavily, with charge controllers, we're interested mainly in the MPPT controllers. So for about 400 watts worth of panels, you're looking at about a 30 amp controller. For about 600 watts of panels, you're looking at about a 45. That's a really common. And then the 60 is the other real common one. And if you have about 800 watts, or what we have on our upper roof, a 60 amp controller is about what you want for that. There are some bigger controllers now. I think there's 80s, and I think I've even seen 100 amp controllers. And you can do that sort of thing, but one thing that's generally said is if you put 2 panels on the top at the Bimini, that's considered its own solar zone with its own lighting characteristics. If you have those ones up there, and especially if it meets the capacity of a given controller, you put a controller in for that. If you decide to put panels in another location, you don't try to tie those in. Even if you're a little underpowered, let's say if you had a 60 amp controller, you only had about 600 watts up there, you wouldn't go and put a panel in a different sort of lighting zone where it could get different shadowing characteristics or different lighting characteristics. You would generally not include that in that to backfill the extra capacity of the controller. From what I've understood from any of the contractors that I did check with is if you're in a certain lighting zone, just try to match the controller to that. If you want to add 2 more in another location, such as on our boat where on the back roof we do have 2 other panels back there, which those accumulate up to about 530 watts, I believe. And we have that going through a 45 amp controller, which we could probably put a little bit more power back there. So if I ever replace those panels, I would probably up them to 300s, and that would probably meet up pretty nice with the 45 amp size. But for now, it's good enough. That was one thing, and it gets a little bit different lighting characteristics back there. Mainly the reason we put panels on the Bimini was even just with that short little arch from that back roof and the radar dome, you get a slight bit of shadowing just on the one spot there on the inside. And more often than not, you would end up in a situation where you would encounter that kind of shadowing. If that's what you're limiting your power production to, it can be a little bit disappointing when you're expecting power and don't get it. That's essentially why we did go and add the panels to the top where there's 0 shadowing, and you know, if there's sun or if there's any available sunlight, we get the power every time on that. So, and then whatever we get on those back panels, it's just a bonus. That works quite well. Now, the type of controllers we're mainly interested in here as well is we're not looking for any PWM based controllers. So that's the pulse width modulated controllers. We're only looking at the MPPT controllers, and those allow you to get that higher DC voltage that I spoke of earlier and combine panels together in series and use a little bit lighter gauge wire. And they work much better for this type of purpose, in my opinion. As far as brands of solar controllers, there's lots of great brands out there. You know, I've generally heard you sort of get what you pay for if you buy inexpensive ones. They'll work just as good initially. Sometimes maybe on the long-term usage, you may have a little bit shorter life on them. It's hard to say. A lot of this stuff just hasn't been out long enough for us to know anyway. And when I bought my controllers, I did buy some nice controllers, or at least the first one that I bought. And you know, I'd had this type of equipment before, and I used the Morningstar stuff. Now, if I was doing it again, I might buy the Morningstar stuff. I have no question on its quality. Its quality is excellent. It's probably mainly in features that they maybe are falling a little short with compared to some of the other modern offerings. I really like the Victron stuff. They have a lot of modern conveniences, a lot of Bluetooth connectivity between your mobile and your device for monitoring. A lot of their systems do talk to each other. Their chargers talk to their solar, and the solar talks to the inverter, and the inverters talk to the ammeters, and it's very well designed stuff. But there's lots of great brands out there. There's brands like Renogy, they make some nice stuff. Who else? Midnight Solar, there's Outback. Lots of great companies out there. Do your research. Whatever you find, it's generally going to be pretty good stuff nowadays. So the backstory on our boat, we started out, I had some issues with some of those flexi panels that I originally put on there, And due to shadowing and some insulating issues and some heat issues, it actually did some damage to some of those. So I did replace those with a pair of 265 watt standard commercial sized panels, put that on a 45 amp controller. Whenever that got sun, it was really good. It put out lots of power. We would see pretty commonly pretty close to that 500 watts or so. But the trouble is, even just that little bit of the arch back there, and the radar is pretty low, but it was close enough that it actually would cast just a bit of a shadow just on the edge of the panels, but that was enough to really knock down the power. And based on that, and us knowing we wanted to expand our solar further, I was looking for a way to expand the solar up over the flybridge. So there was some thoughts about possibly making a hardtop, because a hardtop is a great mounting surface for solar panels, but ended up sticking with the soft top and adding the two 400 watts, totaling 800 watts, and adding a 60 amp controller there. And then both of those controllers just tie into the positive and negative bus and to the battery. I also put a monitoring system on so I could monitor the controllers and how much each one is bringing in, and be able to do any diagnostics if there's issues. And the system has worked great. In its current configuration with these 4 panels, we've been running it now for about just over 2 years now. No issues at all. It puts out lots of power when we need it, even in shoulder season. So dead of winter, even on a sunny day, it's very low output. It's just the way it is with the angle of the sun. But even at shoulder season, we're probably bringing in pretty healthy amounts of power. We're in March now, so we were out last weekend and we were bringing in easily over 50 to 60 amps at the peak times of the day. We didn't have to run the generator all weekend, and we were running the hydronic heating system each night for at least 12 hours. Excellent results, working really good. So the other thing I want to discuss in this, especially for any sort of DIY aspects, is electrical safety in general. Now there's a few areas of electrical safety to be concerned about here. One, the batteries themselves. If you've ever worked with a house battery bank, there is a lot of amps in there. Any sort of metal to metal contact, and metal wristwatches, any sort of metal jewelry, rings, that sort of thing. You should always be careful and use the appropriate methods when working with that kind of power. The other concern is the power coming from the solar arrays. That's to be handled with real care. Really, as soon as you start getting up around 48 volts DC and beyond that, you actually get into electrical levels that could be deadly under the right circumstance. So you do have to treat it with care, treat it with respect, treat it with safety. The pair of panels that I have on the Bimini, those are 36 volts each plus, so they're probably putting out mid 40s. They're somewhere between 80 and 100 volts coming down there. So that is potentially dangerous amounts of electricity. It's not to be handled the way you would just with low amperage 12 volt and just touching things and that sort of thing. You should taking all precautions to insulate yourself from that power, to have that power disabled until it needs to be enabled. And all this power has to be electrically protected with the appropriate circuit breakers. I'm not going to get too much into the specifics on all the exact things you're going to need. I will cover some of this, but if you are at all unsure on any electrical aspects and you aren't familiar with doing your own electrical, it's best to check with a contractor or even hire a contractor to do the electrical terminations and connections. A lot of this type of work isn't really necessarily about the electrical. The electrical is literally the last thing you do. When it comes down to the terminations, and if you are unsure about handling electricity, it's always best to check with a professional and hire one if necessary. So one concern that I've been asked about a few times too is the Bimini strong enough to hold the panels? In my opinion, it is. Now, I can't say that every Bimini that's been constructed has heavy enough tubing or is constructed in such a way where it should be able to hold somewhere between 100 and 150 pounds by the time you add all the additional tubing and panels and any of that sort of thing. But in general, those Bimini structures are pretty strong. Most of them, or at least the ones that I have worked with, they're about 1 inch stainless tubing, usually 316 grade, usually about 0.65 thickness of an inch on the wall thickness. That's generally going to be pretty good. If you ever go to the marina in the wintertime when we get a big heavy snowfall, at least here in the Pacific Northwest, surprisingly enough, you might see some Biminis cave in, but more than often than not, you see an enormous amount of wet snow that can sometimes be suspended for days and days on top of these Biminis. And when you consider what that stuff weighs, some solar panels on there, it doesn't seem to be, I don't think, too much of a problem. Now with that said, if we get snow, I try to get down to the marina and I try to clean them off. And that is one clear advantage actually of having these type of solar panels, is it's a lot easier to sweep the snow off the panels when it's on that glass versus, you know, trying to push the snow off umbrella. It just seems to glide off pretty nicely on the glass. So that's one advantage. It really helps. But I think you have to, like most things, you have to evaluate how your Bimini is mounted and what construction methods have been used and if it truly is kind of strong enough. But I think for the most part, if you're not sure, it's best to check with a specialist for boat tops, and they could probably indicate whether or not it's something you should proceed with, or if there's some other modifications that are required. Let's get on with the mounting the solar panels. In my opinion, these Gemini mounts, these are the key to mounting solar panels on the roof of an existing Bimini. I think there is a patent that allows Gemini to be the only one to build these currently, but the design is just an excellent design for setting up the tubing on top of the existing Bimini top. These mounts allow you to get a raised mount and connect it to your existing Bimini top, and then peek it through. Usually there's some gaps right where the Bimini and the curtains meet. There's usually a gap at the front and a gap further at the back, and usually on both sides, of course. These are the best locations for the mounts. Once the Gemini mounts are in place, the end caps are able to bolt onto each of the mounts. So once you have the end caps on all the Gemini mounts, on each side you want to measure from the inside of each end cap to end cap and get that length to fit that length, and be sure of course you don't cut it too short, because otherwise you'll have to cut a new piece. Measure the distance between each of the end caps. Once you have that distance, cut a piece of stainless tubing, and then that will bridge from the front to the rear, and you'll do that for both sides. Once the horizontal supports are in place, and that's comprised of the tubing, the end caps, and the Gemini mounts, then the widths can be measured across both of the horizontal supports to determine how long the arches have to be from side to side. To do this, you might want to remove the horizontal supports, put 2 stainless tees on, put them back in place, and then position the tees roughly where they will support the arches that will support the panels. This will generally be, depending on the size of the panel, about 25 to 30% inboard from each end. So if you're using a panel that was 65 inches long, you may put the arches about maybe about 30 inches apart. Depending on what you're going to support, you'll want to put the stainless tees on the horizontal supports, temporarily tighten them in those positions to take your measurements. Now regarding the measurements for the arches, these are a little bit more difficult, and they're absolutely critical as far as the measures being fairly precise. Once you have the width measurement, then you do have to determine a height measurement. Now, when you're doing the height measurement, it might even be good to leave the lower portions of the arch a little bit long, because you can always trim that. But it is very critical to get the width correct, because that's kind of a difficult thing. You're not going to get much bend out of the arch without distorting the angle, and you want to make sure that you get that one the first time. If it's too short, then you either have to remake it or add a piece in, or if it's too long, you have to cut it and get it together. Either way, that's fairly undesirable, so you want to make sure you get those measurements correct. You may want to involve the metalwork contractor in the measurement, and they might even want to be involved, because the last thing they want to do is deliver something that's not going to make you happy. When I had mine, I did have a professional come down. He actually wanted to measure it and make sure it was going to be right, and he basically delivered me some bent pieces of stainless that were exactly perfect. I'd probably recommend to do that unless you have the skills and, more importantly, the equipment. Probably the best way to go. So once you receive your arches and they have been bent into place and you put them in, you can now start fitting the panels. Now I used some really heavy, thick PCV tape, and I did do a wrap on the stainless arches right where I sat the panels on top of. And then at the various points where I wanted the panels to be attached to the railing, I used some 1-inch stainless U-bolts, and I think I did have to cut those to length, and then I cleaned them up nicely, and they wrapped around the area where the thick PCV tape was wrapped on the on the stainless tubing, and then used some plastic sleeves where I drilled the holes in the extruded aluminum frames, and so they were fully electrically isolated when they were bolted in. And I would recommend something of that nature, but yeah, it's worked quite well, quite inexpensive. There are a lot of racking options, but the big thing was I didn't want to add any more additional materials up there, mainly for complication, weight. I did check with the solar contractors. I wanted to mainly know if they recommended just putting the panel on those 2 arches, and they assured me that that kind of span will not create any sort of a stress load or any issue for the panels. So I felt, due to simplicity's sake and for the cost and simplicity of some U-bolts and some insulating materials, it seemed to be the best way to go. So once you get your solar panels mounted, the panels will likely have the MC4 connectors on them. So on each panel, there'll be a positive and negative, and you will start routing the wiring from that, and that will go all the way to your solar panel controller. Now there's a number of ways of where you can route it, and it's very difficult to say one size fits all for this, but in my case, I made up a sunbrella sleeve, and just to sort of enclose the wiring, even though it's UV protected, but just to keep it clean and everything, and just put some snaps along that sleeve, and then ran it to the top of the arch. I used some Blue Seas wires glands on the top of the arch, just to make sure they sealed and didn't let any water in. And then I just ran the wiring down the arch and then down through the regular wiring throughways and down into the area where my batteries are contained and my controllers are contained. Ran those wires into the box with the breakers in it that give me the disconnects for the solar. As far as the components you'll need, of course, your solar controller, but it's highly recommend that you use some sort of circuit breaker. Now also, once your panels are up, you can also reinstall your Bimini. Now sometimes that's a little bit tricky because you might have to sort of loosen off a few pieces, maybe take a few pins up so you can sort of slightly retract the forward portion, because usually they're quite taut. But once you get it wrapped around, then you can pull it back down in place and clamp it in place. And the idea is that your arches and panels are going to be just slightly elevated just above the Bimini, but not really touching it. Now mounting the controllers. So with the controllers, especially if you're using vented lead acid batteries, make sure they're not mounted over top or above really in any way of the batteries. Make sure they're somewhere off to the side, and that goes for any electrical components, inverters, chargers. Never mount them right directly above or sort of even right beside above your battery banks if they're vented lead acid. The fumes from when they're charging, it will corrode those controllers or other components, and they won't last as long as they otherwise would. So but otherwise, you want them as close to the batteries as possible, because the further they are away, the more electrical loss there's going to be, because from the controllers to the batteries, that's roughly around that 12 volt range. So you generally want very heavy cables, and you want it nice and close so you don't lose any power. Any of those electrical tie-ins should adhere to the appropriate code and be done properly. And if you aren't sure of what those standards are, either make yourself aware or hire a professional to carry out that work for you. In itself, that's not that much work. Everything else is a whole lot more work, but it's a very important aspect of it, and you want to make sure it's done right. So once everything is connected and verified and you know it's done right, again, you will turn on the power disconnects between the solar controller and the batteries. Once those are on, you'll turn on the solar power. And if the sun's out and if there's any need for electrical load, meters connected to the system, you should be able to see it charging immediately at that point. Depending on the equipment you're using, you should familiarize yourself with the operation and usage of it, but most of it's pretty straightforward these days. So where we're located here, we're located between 48 and 49 degrees north latitude. And in the height of summer, we will commonly see, if our batteries are kind of low and we have a good sunny day, we will commonly see between 80 and 90 amps. Let's see, in shoulder season, probably close to the equinox, we'll see about 40 to 60 amps. And in low season, close to the winter solstice, we're pretty lucky if we see 10 to 20 amps on a good day. So Those are generally the numbers we bring in, you know, in the wintertime, especially close to the solstice. We're going to be running our generator if we need to. And by the time we hit the fall or spring equinoxes, we're still pretty self-sufficient on solar, and we generally don't have to run the generator. So I would encourage anybody to investigate this as an option for themselves. It is very satisfying. You know, the benefits are quite obvious to it, and very reliable. It hasn't failed once for us in all the years we've been boating. And I started working with solar in the early 2000s on earlier boats, and just basically kept adding more solar capacity as the technology became more affordable. And you know, and it's never disappointed me once. It's always been encouraged me to integrate more of it. And but for the most part, we are at a point now where we have enough for our needs, and we have a lot of needs on board our boat, and it seems to cover most of it most of the time. So it's a good system. So final thoughts. When you are designing your system, and you're trying to figure out what capacity, whatever you can do to make it as large as you can, that's generally going to be the right course of action. Again, I mentioned it before, you're not necessarily putting the solar to match a nice bright sunny day. You're putting the solar on there to match whatever day you're out boating. So if it's a cloudy, rainy one, if it's kind of cloudy and overcast for 2 or 3 days, that's what you're putting your capacity on there for. You know, otherwise, put as much as you have money and room for on your boat. You know, in high season, a lot of the time what happens is the solar panels charge your batteries, and they do carry the load of the boat all day long with any electrical loads that are happening. And then at night, that's the only time you end up using the batteries. Battery sizing, you basically have to make sure that you can get through 1 night, 2 nights, however many nights you figure between getting power. And in high season, generally you're just trying to get yourself through the next night. Now what that does is that does reduce the cycling on the batteries. Your battery bank will last longer, and you don't need as big a bank sometimes in some cases. So, you know, something to think about. Sometimes when you increase the solar, and depending on what time of the year you do your boating and what kind of power needs you have, you might actually get away with a smaller battery bank when you have a decent sized solar array. So I know this has been a long video, but hopefully some of this information, some of these tips can help people set up solar on their boat better than it might have been otherwise. And yeah, if you have any interesting situations or any setups or any questions, you know, feel free to leave a comment below. And other than that, thank you for watching. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, hit the like button. We really like that. It really helps out with the channel. And yeah, again, thank you for watching.